Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias.
And I'm Christian, the Chief Executive Officer of Artorias, and we are in the presence of greatness. Oliver Alexander is back on our show. Today we're going to be talking about European arms and rearmament. So welcome aboard, Oliver.
It's good to be back.
So, Oliver, first thanks for joining us and kind of the first episode we had with you as a guest. We talked about kind of the situation in Russia, Ukraine, and a lot of it about, kind of Russia's economy and kind of some of that degradation that we were seeing. But now, now with the new Trump administration, the second Trump administration, one of the fundamental shifts we're seeing in the European continent is kind of this idea of, Europe taking ownership of its own defense. They're still talking about kind of obviously within the NATO construct, but the European Union kind of got the message and is trying to, refocus a lot of attention on their own defense requirements. And we're seeing even countries individually take actions and then collectively. But kind of one of the major aspects that I think it would be great to kind of start this podcast is France, President Macron, alluding to this idea that French nuclear weapons, kind of the nuclear umbrella, France will take over it and kind of extend it to the European continent, to the European Union. And we're seeing France take over this role that the United States historically had as of its nuclear umbrella. Now France is doing that. And so I'd like your immediate reaction to that and kind of France is extending its nuclear umbrella and kind of what that kind of means for the European continent as a whole.
Yeah, I think definitely you still have to take it with a grain of salt because the past few years have shown that France and Macron will say things, but they won't necessarily happen because France is a bit of an unpredictable, slightly unstable country at times. So, what's said might not necessarily be what's done, but just the fact that it's a conversation that's being had right now is quite a change from what's historically been their own very personal nuclear umbrella. And then being able to extend this nuclear umbrella over Europe does decrease dependency on the US nukes. There won't, of course, be as many nuclear weapons as the US can provide, but between the UK and France, it would be a sizable nuclear deterrent, at least in the interim, until something else happens. And it wouldn't surprise me that we will start seeing nuclear proliferation basically around the globe at this point with what's happening with the US relations with basically everyone at this point. If you're even just looking outside of Europe, if you're, South Korea, you're Australia and stuff, you might start looking towards acquiring other methods to defend yourself if you don't really feel the US is going to be there to back you up.
I think one of the big problems that the United States runs into is every 4 years, there's an election. Norms have previously dictated that some of the policy and the agreements made by the previous administration would still be honored. And so what effect are you seeing across Europe in terms of this sort of shell shock that we've seen over the course of just the last 2 months?
Just because I want to use the term that every other analyst, journalist, and columnist has used in the past week. It's probably been a wake-up call for Europe. I get to use it as well. I think this election has shown that, at least as the political climate in the US is right now, it's hard to see the US as a reliable ally that can continue to provide this, umbrella of protection over Europe. Because even if best case scenario for Europe in 2 years, there's a midterm in the US that goes heavily Democrat and makes Trump a lame duck president, you'll still end up in a situation where the US foreign policy turned basically 180 overnight. And as long as the political climate in the US is the same as it is right now, that's still a possibility that can change every 4 years. And that's not really a reliable partner if you have them going, ping-ponging every 4 years. So I think there is going to be a buildup. I'm seeing it. Here in Denmark, there's been a massive buildup over the last 2 years. It's only accelerating after the election with dramatic changes to defense policy that hasn't really been seen since, I would say, since the Cold War, but I don't even think it's been this extreme like during the Cold War. Even during the Cold War, there was significant hesitancy to really you know, arm Denmark. That seems to be almost completely gone now. We're getting changes to the way procurement happens. They're removing this law that required the parliament to be involved in any major procurement, where they kind of had to, agree politically. Where now they're handing over the the right to decide what gets bought and purchased from the military back to the military, so they can make their own decisions on what gets purchased to make stuff happen faster and be able to kind of both change doctrine and change, technology rapidly to this changing environment. And there's just a massive influx of money. We're seeing, I mean, we have Poland saying they won't rule out, getting nuclear weapons in the future, or at least unconventional arms. We have them pulling out of conventions. We have Finland talking about the same. 2 days ago, we had the Danish prime minister say something that was quite extraordinary for a Danish prime minister, saying they wouldn't rule out nuclear weapons on Danish soil. When asked if that was an option, she just replied and said she wouldn't rule out anything at this time. I don't know how well versed you are in Danish nuclear policy concerning NATO going back to the 50s. That's always been a very, very hot button issue. During the early 50s, there was nuclear artillery and also nuclear capable air-to-air missiles in Denmark, or ground-to-air missiles, sorry, in Denmark, but they were never armed with nuclear weapons because Denmark did not want nukes on our territory, which meant that all the actual nuclear warheads were stored about a kilometer south of the border in Germany. And now suddenly we're kind of taking this stand and at least opening up the possibility to change this pretty decisive policy.
So actually, Oliver, to that point, though, I guess the question then would become, it's a two-part question. One, is this an idea where, because right now the only nuclear powers in the European continent, I mean, obviously outside of Russia, but part of the European Union and NATO in Europe would be the United Kingdom, which is not part of the EU, obviously, and then France, which is part of the EU and NATO. And so is this their idea that historically the United States has been the one that kind of pushed its nuclear arsenal forward? Is there an appetite within Denmark to accepting right now French or UK nuclear missiles? And the second question is, can you lay out specifically, at least for Denmark, what specific measures are they putting in place to try to address this requirement to increase defense spending and modernization?
I mean, it's still it's very new. It was a statement that was made, and it was more of like a we won't rule it out rather than any definitive statements. I don't think it's really become a political issue yet. I think given the situation, I think if it were to happen right now would be a very good time for it to happen politically. I don't think there'd be that much pushback. The whole getting nuclear weapons you know, on your soil for the first time would of course be a massive political thing, and there would definitely be parties against it. And I don't know if it would ever be fully accepted, but the climate is there right now for it to happen if it were to happen at any point. As for the second part, I mean, defensive spending in Denmark has increased significantly for being one of the countries that was well below the 2% a couple of years ago. We're now aiming for 3%, possibly with some talks even going above 3% very soon. We had some massive influx of some massive payments in the military. Haven't really been paid out directly from the military yet, but coming this year, and just a bunch of acquisitions and future acquisitions coming in, on top of being the largest donor to Ukraine per capita. Something like about, if I remember correctly, is about 1,850 euros per person has been sent as aid to Ukraine over the past 3 years, which is almost 10 times as much per person as the US has sent.
So, in one question I would like to ask, because we're seeing is individual countries raising defense spending, and that's almost across the board. We've seen this already previously in Eastern Europe, and now we're seeing an increase in Western Europe. But that's kind of at the individual country level. But recently, the European Union held kind of like this emergency session, and they allocated $800 billion under the what do they call the rearm program, right? And this idea of rearming the European security and military. What is kind of the differences between what the European Union is doing and kind of the policies and focuses that they're taking in place in the European Union compared to each individual state's own decision? Is there synergy between both programs, or are these two separate ones that are trying to tackle two separate problems?
I think there's definitely synergy in it. I just think Denmark is in a position where financially we can afford to do this. Like the climate is there right now for this to happen. It is going to mean that there are going to be some cutbacks on some of the, security nets that Denmark has been one of the countries that had the biggest, best, social security net in the world. But I think right now people are willing to accept it because at least a large majority of people in Denmark understand that in order to have this, you need to have security first. And that's been a kind of a hot button topic in Denmark for the past couple of years. So I think people finally started to accept, especially with the US kind of pulling out of Europe, that, okay, we might have free hospitals, free healthcare, free schools, free universities, but if we don't have a country, we're not going to keep having that. So maybe pay a little bit extra for this, pay a little bit extra for that, and then be able to defend the country. I think that's very important to people here. As for the EU, I think those funds are going to be very important. I think they're going to be there to help countries that don't have the funds to do this, that don't have as high a GDP per capita. I'm going to have a harder time funding this. It might also make it easier for some of the countries that don't feel directly threatened by Russia to maybe start, spending more on their military. It's always been kind of a problem with both NATO in Europe and generally the European Union trying to agree on these things because the threat from Russia is significantly bigger for Poland than it is for Portugal, for example. And trying to convince Portugal that they have to cut their, social security network and stuff to increase defense spending when they're as far away from Russia as it's basically possible to be is always going to be hard. It's also going to be hard in a country that doesn't have as high a GDP per capita because it just, requires you to, in essence, get a bit poor to stay safer. But at the same time, you have to, how much safer will they be by spending more on their military?
I'll jump in here as well. I think a lot of these smaller countries that have struggling economies, or even some of the larger ones that are trying to rebuild their economy after 2008, specifically Spain and other regions, Portugal as being one, Italy to some extent, could use this opportunity for this rearmament to boost their economies, to open factories, to employ some of their population, their civilians, into more sophisticated engineering jobs. And even if this war was to cool down and not be that big of a problem, you'd still have all of that labor that's more skilled than they were previously, and try to do kind of what Germany did after World War II to shuffle a lot of their engineering might back into other fields, such as the automotive industries and so forth. The Italians did that well as well. I mean, this could be a great opportunity for the EU as a whole to situate themselves well. To ask you a question, Oliver, since you're the only person in this chat that actually lives in the EU, regarding the 300 billion or so in seized Russian assets that are controlled under EU banking and so forth. Do you ever see there being a direct alignment to be able to utilize those funds, whether it be to rearm the EU or to assist Ukraine if the US was to falter completely and pull out 100%? Or do you think that will always be like a point of contention? Because, like, from my perspective, I don't see why it hasn't been at least threatened more to Russia, especially since it's a lot of Russian civilians' assets as well, as a way to try to curb this war from expanding, but also potentially starting to use some of those funds to help in the situation that we discussed.
I think it's a possibility. I don't think it's that likely yet. I'd hope it were to happen, but I mean, one of the problems with the EU is you've also expanded it so far that you have countries that are kind of have different political leanings, and you have countries like Hungary right now, which are not really in alignment with the rest of the EU regarding what to do about the Ukraine-Russia situation, is probably to put it lightly. And as long as you have countries like this that can kind of veto decisions, it's always going to be hard. At the same time, I think there's also possibly a fear in Brussels about if you liquidate all these assets and give them to Ukraine, it might create some insecurity around the entire EU banking system, because if you suddenly take money that technically isn't yours that you've frozen and start using it for other things, you might see other money from other actors kind of pull out of the Brussels banking system, the European banking system, because they might take our money if we, kind of get in something that the EU does not think we should be doing. And there's probably certain countries around the Middle East and maybe also Chinese money and stuff that might think that would be a bad idea for future investments. I think that could, at least I think they think it could definitely hurt the European Union and just the general European banking system in the long run.
Yeah, I
So
don't disagree with that point either. To the point of U.S. involvement in Ukraine and obviously the Western security apparatus as a whole, I think at this moment in time, at least from my perspective, to your point earlier, it's incredibly hard to trust the United States. I mean, the rhetoric that even surrounding Canada, and I know we're talking about the EU in this discussion, but even surrounding Canada is very, very stark, very Putinist. The way he's been talking about annexing parts of Canada, trying to take over the Great Lakes, going back to some of the disputed territory previous to all the cooperation agreements that Canada and the U.S. put together surrounding Maine and northern New Hampshire. I ironically live in one of those areas that would be directly affected by a annexation. Um, I live in an area that was a disputed territory at one point. Um, and like the rhetoric surrounding that should be, and I know you said it earlier, it is the joke, but a wake up call to Europe. And I think it should be more than just a wake up call in the sense that you might not be able to trust the United States to secure you in the event of a war, but also secure you in event of economic relationships and also in the event of not just trying to take over your country. I mean, hell, look at the rhetoric surrounding Greenland. It's the exact same situation. So I think the US is failing in a multitude of ways, and I don't see this being able to be something that another administration can come in and swiftly undo. I think a lot of these relationships are very strained, and I only see it getting worse over the next 3 years and in almost 11 months.
I mean, the US has succeeded in kind of burning 80 years of soft power buildup in about 2 months and destroying several important relationships. I think the main difference between this Trump term and last Trump term is it seems like he's, because Trump's always kind of been, his opinion is whatever the opinion of the last guy he talked to is. He's kind of like putting a cucumber in the fridge, kind of just takes whatever taste of anything else in the fridge. But like, it just appears that he's surrounded himself with even worse actors this time around. Sycophants that are probably more focused on foreign policy than they were last time. The last election cycle and the last presidency were more focused on domestic issues, it seems, where this time it's very foreign policy centric, led by people that I don't feel have the best interests of the US at heart. And if they do, they have very misguided and I don't know, uh, like understandings of what it means to help the US in foreign policy. I mean, you have the world's largest net importer of goods deciding to put tariffs on things willy-nilly and then deciding the day after, actually, we won't tariff you for a month, and then we'll put tariff you again, and then we might not tariff you, which is,
That
creating massive uncertainty without actually getting any of the benefits that he claims he would get from tariffs. Is just kind of adding all of the negative parts of it.
Yeah, the wishy-washiness also that wishy-washiness highlights to every single decision he's made so far. And like I said, I don't think another actor can come in and save him. I feel like it's a him responsibility at this point to realign his administration to follow the usual course of action with the United States foreign policy and internal policy, whether that be economically or militarily. I mean, even within the last 24 hours, we're seeing going back and forth, at least regarding the intelligence sharing, where at first, for the first few hours, it was completely halted, and then it was okay. We're actually going to drip feed you some information. Oh, okay. We're not going to help you with targeting, but we're going to help you with some minor defense around Kyiv. And it's just gone like it's so mix mash that like it depends on who you talk to in the administration of how extreme things are. I also think the State Department being run by Rubio at the moment is completely being gutted, and Rubio finding out about foreign policy decisions sometimes even days after Trump has made a decision, is just it's absolutely wild and it's completely backward on how the United States has been run previously. The only time I
I
could
think
ever, only time I could think of a similar situation is maybe under the Bush administration during Iraq '03, but like outside of that, I'm not seeing too much similarities here from another situation like this.
at the same time, you have all of this happening, like foreign policy wise, while you have Elon Musk running around just, gutting the government like left and right, just pulling out random cables, seeing what breaks. That's also making things like exponentially worse. There are times like when we get these statements that come out from different people and different anonymous, government sources and stuff. It doesn't feel like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing in the US government right now. Like at times the left hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. It's just chaos. And you have these statements that come out. I mean, a Trumpism, that happened a lot before, but you have some of them now, which, like you can see there's a kernel of truth to them where like doesn't quite know what he's talking about. You had the whole he wanted to add a tariff to the EU because they were tariffing the US because they had a VAT, value added tax on all items from the US. Yes, they are on all items that are sold from everywhere. It's just a tax on items. I mean, in Denmark, it's 25%. It's on everything. It's not specifically tariffing the US.
What he
And like
feels
you just,
VAT though is that it's an effect on the person purchasing. It's not the effect on
yeah, yeah.
still
He
follow.
just has these like random statements that come out of nowhere, and it's like it's just constantly changing. Not to mention the whole like crypto pump and dump, like clear insider trading happening with the Suns and stuff. It's just chaos at this point. It's like mob rule, and that'll be interesting to see. I don't know what's gonna happen in a year. To be honest, I don't know what's gonna happen 15 minutes from now.
I think that's one of the biggest problems is it's impossible to sort of read the room, and that doesn't make for a good partner. And I think a lot of people had higher hopes in Rubio. He was confirmed with 99 votes. I think one person was absent. And, we just saw that disastrous meeting in the Oval Office, and Rubio looked incredibly uncomfortable. I think he wanted to just kind of sink into that couch, but it really doesn't seem like he is truly in control of the State Department and the policies. And that's definitely concerning. And, we're hearing from Dmitry Peskov that in Russia, the Kremlin is saying that US foreign policy largely aligns with Kremlin foreign policy or Russia's foreign policy. That is certainly disturbing and is going to give our allies pause. And I worry about, the coordination with AUKUS, with our partners in in the Indo-Pacific. I worry about Five Eyes as well. So we're going to see secondary and tertiary effects of this down the line. But I'm sure when we hear, and maybe you have a comment on this, but Stormer from the UK and Macron from France were considering escorting Zelensky to the next visit in DC. That's also very concerning.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of those partnerships are gonna they might officially stay there, but I think they're definitely gonna compartmentalize like Five Eyes and stuff. I don't think the UK is sharing as much as they were earlier. I don't think I think a lot of people are scared that there's gonna be like, it's gonna be compromised and passed off to the Russians and potentially the Chinese because you're firing tons of employees that have top secret clearances that suddenly, don't have a job and might be interested in selling their secrets. And you have very credible reporting that both Russia and China are trying to increase their network of people that will sell them information at the same time, and you have just this kind of perfect storm of secrets being passed and there being holes in the cheese everywhere. So I think it's just because of the complete chaos that's happening at the top right now. And I think if this were the other way around, I mean, if this were Biden still, there'd be the conversation of this is an 80-year-old man that they're clearly taking advantage of. And I still think I thought that was the case with Biden at the end, and I think that's the case with Trump now. Like, I mean, when they ask him about stuff that you clearly see he doesn't know what they're talking about. You brought up AUKUS. I mean, they asked him about that. One of those one of those Oval Office interview or press conferences. I can't remember what it was. I just remember some journalist asked him a question, and he clearly didn't have any idea what it was. So you have these situations happening right now. And as for Marco Rubio, I feel that personally, I feel like it's sad because Democrat or Republican, I feel like he was always a competent politician. He was definitely a competent, like he was competent at his job. He knew what he was doing. You might not agree with the man politically, but he was never bad at his job. He was clearly gifted at what he was doing. And now he's decided to kind of, sell his soul to the devil for a chance in this administration that is clearly not going how he thought it would go. And this is probably going to significantly hurt his future ambitions, which are significantly higher than the position he's in right now. And I mean, that's if nothing else, it's kind of it's kind of sad for him.
Yeah,
So,
Rubio, across the entire political spectrum, Rubio has always been kind of a shining star, and has always been fantastic at what he does. And to my point earlier, I think if the Trump administration, the high up Trump administration, is able to start qualming some of the issues that are arising, I don't necessarily believe that all hope is lost, at least at the moment. I think damage has been done. But to my point earlier, if you know what I mean, like if I'm walking down the street and someone hits me with their car, I'm not going to go and blame it on the police officer that shows up to fix it. I'm going to blame it on the person that hit me with the car. So like if some responsibility needs to be taken for these last few weeks and to change course before it is too late.
but if I could jump in on that, I think it's an important. One of the interesting aspects that was reported, actually was reported even, is that the Russian strikes that happened last night in Ukraine really infuriated Trump, and I think it kind of follows that this idea of it looks like clearly where Trump's policy is, regardless of the ramifications, is ceasefire peace deal now, and his ire is directed either at Zelensky or Putin, whoever he perceives is not accomplishing that goal. But I think one of the another because I think this is a question that needs to be asked, right? And the kind of the argument that would probably be said by the other side, and in GOP circles or Republican circles, foreign policy circles, is and this kind of this idea of European security. Russia invading Crimea in 2014 didn't really elicit a response in the European Union, right? And the European nations didn't take that as a wake up call. Russian invasion into Ukraine was a slight wake up call, right? But the significant efforts for rearmament, the rush that I think was needed, that should have happened post 2022, post the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, only happened with the political tensions with the United States, and because the United States basically made it abundantly clear, and Secretary Hesketh in the NATO summit said, we are reprioritizing our national security, and they said the border and the Indo-Pacific with China and the near-peer competition. But it took kind of a second Trump presidency to kind of wake up, hopefully, I guess, this wake up for Europe, for the European Union. But the question is, why did it take the United States to act as it is acting for Europe to wake up and not Russia invading Ukraine? And doesn't that kind of vindicate kind of the criticisms in some of the GOP circles and in the United States, where the Europeans were just taking advantage of our security umbrella, and now that we removed it, that is when Europe woke up. Don't you believe that's kind of a somewhat fair criticism to the lackluster performance we've seen in Europe for the last couple of decades?
For sure. I mean, I've also been vocally critical of this, but I do think it's important to remember that the European Union is 27 separate member states that each have their own foreign policy and their own defense policy. And I think it's in some way unfair to say that, all of the countries haven't been doing it, where some countries significantly responded to what happened in 2022, for example. You have countries like Poland, you have the Baltics, you have Denmark building up, you have several countries that have done a lot. You also have a lot of countries that have had, as you said, kind of a lackluster defense policy and defense spending. And again, I think that's kind of the problem with painting Europe as a single entity, because you have countries like, for example, Portugal or Spain that are so far away from Russia that even Russia invading Ukraine, it's hard domestically to make that your problem, other than, just the whole ethical concerns around it. Because It's not really a problem for your security if you're Portugal right now. It's not really a problem if you're Spain. You still have, if they reach you, they've gone through a lot of other countries, and it's everyone else's problem before it's your problem. And I think that's one of the main things. And I think it's just hard. And those countries don't have the economies to kind of switch over. I think Germany, for example, probably should have switched over a lot earlier. I think Germany is in this weird situation where it's always kind of been a bit of a bumblebee in Europe. It really shouldn't exist in the way that it exists. It's this huge industrial nation that doesn't really have any of its own resources. It's kind of like this weird enigma. And I think they're having a hard time. They've been having a hard time economically for several years, especially with their reliance on our previous reliance on Russian gas, cheap Russian gas. So it's always kind of been hard. The second they stopped using that, it just got hard economically for them. And because of that, suddenly the money is not there. All this extra money that you could pump into defense is not there. And you got to try to fix the domestic problems before you can fix them. And I think this was, to use the famous quote, the wake up call that they needed. That now they like this is the final, now we're going. So in that case, I do think that the U.S. kind of pulling back is the thing that made everyone else start trying to pull their weight. But at the same time, if Trump expects that you can burn all of this, make all these people pull their own weight, and then kind of come back and just use soft power to kind of get back into the position you were in before, I don't think that will happen. I think that there is a move to independence from the U.S. now. And there is going to be a permanent loss of soft power over Europe that comes with this independence. I don't think that's calculated into the plan as much as we just want them to pay for their own defense. 10 years from now, Europe will probably pay for its own defense, but it will also have taken a significant step away from the US and won't be willing to, come to the US's aid when they call, and won't be able to, be used politically for the US in whatever future conflicts or crises emerge in the same way that they were today, or maybe 2 months ago.
And that's where I see sort of a shortcoming in that argument. Saying that we're focusing on our national defense ignores the fact that the United States has a foothold in Europe. And that helps us get over this, geographic modifier that is the Atlantic Ocean. And it allows us to project that power. That is all part of our defense, of our national security. AFRICOM is based in Germany, and we have the Alice Springs listening station in Australia, which gives us insight into the Indo-Pacific. So all of these are very important alliances that make the United States stronger and more formidable. And I think just going to the point with Germany, there's discussion now again of pulling out 35,000 American troops from Germany. And I've even heard it discussed that they might end up in Hungary. Hungary doesn't have that infrastructure. I don't know how they would manage to do that in 4 years. I know Trump tried a drawdown previously that was reversed by Biden. But this concept that we need to look completely inward and that the borders are a bigger threat than countries like Russia, I just don't think that is a solid argument.
No, I mean, look back 10, 20 years, if the US said jump, every country in Europe, basically all they would ask would be how high. Now, 10 years from now, if there's a conflict between the US and China, I think it's going to be a lot harder to get the EU involved, both, financially and militarily, if need be, than it would have been 20 years ago.
Well, to
I
that
don't
point,
think.
to that
Oh,
point, if Trump continues his narrative, if Taiwan was invaded, are we really at war with China at that point? Because if we're doing this to Ukraine and we've supported Ukraine, hell,
really.
since the early 2000s, like where is Taiwan in this equation? So I don't know if Trump is just trying to like pull us completely out of the entire geopolitical landscape in a sense of like, okay, well, if we're so isolated, we can prevent World War III from happening, which I guess to some capacity, um, you are
I
protecting
mean,
yourself. But at the end of the day, like all of the basically the entire modern world is this globalist system, whether that's economically or militarily, where people are reliant on each other just as much as we're reliant on Canada for our oil exports. Portugal is relying on us for defense. It's just kind of like it's just a really bizarre way of thinking. And like I said previously, like we try to stay very apolitical on this podcast. Stefano texted me halfway through a discussion, but I think the point needs to be it's not so much who's in charge, it's the decisions in which they're making. And like I said previously, they still have a lot of legroom in this presidency to start undoing some of the damage they've been doing. But if they continue treading in the path that we're treading down now, what's to say we don't get pulled out of NATO? What's to say that we don't get pulled out of Five Eyes? What's to say that we don't go and try to annex Canada or that bombs start flying in this in South America? So yeah, I mean, I agree with you wholeheartedly, Matt, with like how can we look at the border crisis and say that that's a bigger issue than what's happening in Eastern Europe currently? And I can't fathom, at least on my end of it, of how it is more important than what's happening in Europe. I mean, we're talking about the outside of Russia, the largest European country being attacked right now, like currently as we speak, being bombed, being drone striked, people dying, civilians being slaughtered. And like we have not all the leverage in the world. I won't put us on a pedestal like that, but we have enough leverage in the world where if we stop assisting, it makes a massive difference to what happens to the civilians there.
I have kind of like a sliver of hope that something might happen there that, he chose to remove everything from Ukraine because that was the easiest option. He doesn't really care about what happens there. He just wants, make his peace in, the first 100 days, as he said, or first 90 days. I don't remember which one he said. And then, then he gets the win. The war that Biden couldn't stop, he gets to win. He gets to stop this war. As it pushes on, I doubt Russia is going to agree to much of anything. I could see a situation where, which is, the classic thing with a strong man versus a strong man, where Putin suddenly doesn't give Trump what he wants and starts making Trump look bad because Trump's promising ceasefire here, ceasefire there, and then Russia keeps attacking, that he might, turn back around and start giving a lot of aid to Ukraine because suddenly Russia's the one that's annoying because Russia's the one that won't agree to any ceasefire. And I think that's Ukraine's best bet right now, is that they're
Yeah.
not subservient to the US, but they're open to this, ceasefire proposal in a way, because I don't see, as of right now, I don't see any way why Russia would agree to it. And if Russia doesn't agree to it, suddenly Russia is the one that's ruining Trump's plan of ending this war that Biden couldn't end, and is making him look bad. And once that happens, I could, the pendulum is going to swing the other way all of a sudden.
No, I completely agree with that. I wholeheartedly agree with that assessment. And I think I talked to Matt one night about this recently in the last couple of months. We had this discussion before Trump even came into office where it was like, I think he's going to try to end this war, but who the fuck knows what side he's going to choose? Who knows who he's going to arm? Who knows if it's going to be US first, Russia first, Ukraine first? Like all that was irrelevant. It was, hey, can we put Putin and Trump in the same room and have a conversation that doesn't end with bloodshed? And like
Yeah, like
it's from the current perspective of like how things even have transpired today, whether that is the 35,000 troops that he wants to push more towards Eastern Europe, or the fact that he had some rhetoric today on social media. And like one thing I know for a fact is that Trump does control those social media accounts like through and through. And his rhetoric towards Putin was not the same rhetoric that it was a week ago. And I think why we benefited so greatly, at least from the United States perspective, with the Biden administration is because Biden was so terrible. Like he was just so bad in terms of like being a strong man. He was consistent as all hell. I'll give him that. He was very consistent, but he also wasn't very strong in any of his wording or aggression towards Russia. And also, no one took him seriously on the world stage or even internally in the United States, anyways, to really listen to his points. Trump is the complete opposite end of that, where like you don't actually know what Trump's going to say because he is so erratic and so headstrong in whatever he believes. So, to your point, if Trump decides tomorrow that, all right, maybe Ukraine was right, maybe I should put my beef with Zelensky away from 2019 and put my hands down and realize, okay, I got to figure out how to help the Ukrainians. How far does that go? Because we're seeing how his rhetoric is with the cartels, and I mean, I know Stefano dipped out of here a little early for some personal things, but Stefano would be the first person to say it. I think we're going to see bombs drop on Mexico within 3 months or
Well,
some.
we saw the U.S. flying rivet joints over the uh, Gulf of Mexico and Gulf
Exactly.
of California. So that's certainly something that we weren't seeing previously. And I will say, Biden, to your point, Biden's foreign policy um, weakness reminds me a lot of what we saw from Obama with Crimea and then with Syria and allowing Russia to get that foothold in Syria because we wasted time there and then having to come in after ISIS had already established this foothold. So I do see the parallels there, but I do think with Trump and that ego and the way he makes decisions, when you have someone like Peskov making comments that Russia's goal is still maximum damage in Ukraine, that kind of undermines this idea that Trump is trying to work towards a peace agreement.
Yeah, into our conversation the last time, Oliver, I guess would be another tie along to a previous conversation we had is like, all right, let's say for some capacity the some sort of treaty signed or some sort of long-term ceasefire is agreed to or whatnot. How long does Russia have before their economy completely cripples without this war operating? And like I still, back to our conversation previously, don't see an off put for Putin. I don't see a way for him to save face in this or to save his economy in this if this war was to end. But on the flip side, if this war continues, I think we're in a catch-22 where I do believe what you said wholeheartedly that we're going to be into a larger, more drawn out conflict, larger than we've seen up to date.
And personally, I think that like, yeah, it is a catch-22 because the war is draining their economy. I think it all depends on which sanctions are lifted on Russia during any eventual ceasefire. I also think even in a situation where sanctions are lifted, they're going to have problems because if they signed a full-on peace deal tomorrow, you suddenly have hundreds of thousands of probably the most PTSD-ridden soldiers since World War II, probably even more so than probably closer to like World War I style because of all the drones and stuff, suddenly going back into Russian society, not to mention the hundreds of thousands that are, crippled and wounded to a point where they can't work. You have a lot of their GDP growth comes from wartime production that suddenly, you know, isn't really as useful and needs to stop. I mean, that's going to be a massive hit to their economy, and that's going to be a massive hit to their domestic political system. And I think that's going to be hard. It's kind of similar to what happened, when they pulled out of Afghanistan and got hit by that like Afghanistan shock of all the troops coming home and all this kind of changing. So I think that could be a major factor in not ending the war. Going back to the whole Trump situation, as I said, I don't think he cares about, like, I don't have a feeling that he doesn't really care about what the outcome is. He doesn't care about who wins. He just wants to end the war because he can end the war that Biden couldn't. He gets a win on Biden. If he ends the war, could very well win the Nobel Peace Prize, which gets him his, I got one too on Obama, which also is something I think is pretty important to him. He gets to be the guy who made, the biggest deal ever. He stopped the biggest war in Europe since World War II. All of these things are massive wins that he can, be proud of. And I think that's what's important to him right now. I don't think it's important to him if Russia loses or Ukraine loses. I think right now he's playing for the strongest horse, and in the situation right now, there are situations where it's easier to pressure Ukraine right now because you're providing them with aid than it is to, you know, put additional pressure on Russia. If Ukraine doesn't fold immediately, which they won't, and there's nothing to indicate they'll collapse immediately due to US support stopping, and Russia continues to press, suddenly it might become more viable to start pushing Russia, sending additional things to Ukraine, additional sanctions on Russia, try to pressure them and see if you can make them capitulate so you can get your deal. And that's the situation I'm hoping for. I do think it requires a falling out with some of the people that are close to him right now that might have other interests. But historically, his position, different position of different cabinet position stuff usually haven't lasted his entire term. So I don't see a situation personally where him and Elon Musk, for example, are best of friends 4 years from now. I think at some point they'll have some major disagreement and falling out.
I agree.
And depending on what happens there, I think, you know, there are people whispering in his ear that maybe they're more interested in Russia winning. There are probably also people whispering in his ear that would like Ukraine to win. I think it also partly depends on which one of those factions wins out. I think
Right.
a lot of the other people will just fall in line, like people like Lindsey Graham, for example, or other people. They just kind of, toe the party line.
I think there also needs to be something to say in regards to like that Trump might be interested in the mineral deposits and the economic benefits that happen if Ukraine was to hand over some of those assets. But I think there also needs to be something to say about the fact that he's going to win a lot more if he can secure Europe and stop Ukrainian lives from dying. If Russia ends up taking all of Ukraine, that's going to be less economic development and less cooperation between Europe and the United States. To your point about Russia, the political unraveling of Russia, if all of those servicemen went back, I just want to make a very clear statement here that up until 2021, only 2,459 U.S. military personnel died in Afghanistan, and when they came back, it was a complete upheaval to the status quo in terms of policy and how people looked at war on a day-to-day basis. And it's hurt our recruiting numbers, and that's still a massive stain on us. But just for context, up to the latest data goes up to October 2024. 600,000 Russians have been killed. It averages for casualty rate around 1,200 per day. That are so every 2 days we basically have the same amount of casualties as the Afghanistan war. It is just absolutely insanity. And I do not see how Putin, like I said, even economically, but even just internal policy, how he stays in power if all of the people start coming home. So unless
And
ceasefire happens and everybody stays in their camps and they wait to start fighting again, I do not see how that just doesn't completely unravel all of Russian society.
And he loses, when he went into Syria, that was sort of a rallying cry for Russia. And I assume Ukraine to some extent is doing the same thing. One of the things to build off your point that I think is very important is to keep in mind that there are also a lot of conscripts. So not necessarily people who wanted to join the military. And that was a huge problem in the United States during Vietnam. And that is why we saw so much upheaval during that time period. So I wouldn't be surprised if, like both of you were saying, this is going to cause a massive headache and there's not really an off ramp. It's not like they can deploy all of these people into the Sahel or Syria. There's just not going to be a need for that many people. And the last thing I would say about this Ukrainian situation and this deal that Trump's looking at potentially with mineral resources, until there's some sort of security guarantee, whether that is through Europe or through the United States, I think he's going to have problems selling that concept because nothing is stopping Putin from just reconstituting the military and going back in. And while Trump may believe Putin and trust him, I don't think the Ukrainians or Europe will.
No, I mean, adding on that, the fact that I have a hard time seeing any situation where Putin will accept anything resembling a permanent ceasefire without regime change in Ukraine, because I mean, they want Donbass, they want Luhansk, but at the same time, they want the next Luhansk, but at the same time, one of the major things behind their special military operation was removing the government in Kiev. And if they fail to do that, the main objective of their entire 3-year war has failed. And that's going to be such like a massive internal political defeat for him that I don't think he'll accept that. I don't think he'll accept any situation that doesn't have regime change. And I think that's going to be hard to get into these ceasefire agreements or anything. So I think
I agree.
due to that, it's basically a non-starter.
And I think
I mean,
it's a non-starter for the Ukrainian position as well. And to our point about Trump and his wishy-washiness, one of the things that he did recently, and most of this is rumoured, but it's pretty much confirmed at this point, is that Ukraine has I mean, excuse me, the United States Trump administration has had internal discussions with some of the opposition leaders in Ukraine. That has actually occurred. Um, and to your point, Oliver, like Russia does want regime change in Ukraine. They want a more neutral government, and whatever that means, whatever that looks like. They see Euromaidan as an absolute failure and a stain on post USSR relationship between Ukraine and Russia. And not to get too in depth of that, because I know it's a super polarizing topic, but that's a lot of the reason why Putin went for Crimea as soon as Euromaidan concluded. It was to project power back onto Ukraine to be like, hey, we're still part of your history. And we're kind of in a dangerous spot right there where, yeah, it is a non-starter. And I don't agree with the mantra of, oh, let's run an election during wartime to see if Zelensky gets voted out. And even if that was the case, he still has an incredibly high approval rating because he hasn't left. And he's done a very good job of keeping the country in order under wartime, whether that's getting the economy still afloat, keeping people in work, trying his absolute best not to just pull random people off the street to fight for the war. I think he's doing a fantastic job, both on the fundraising, but also in the actual political sphere. Um, and yeah, I don't see it being I don't see that being a situation where the Ukrainians would stop fighting while losing probably LPR and the DPR, as well as losing the Zelensky regime and that entire side of the government. I don't see that being anything that the Ukrainians would agree to, even like normal Ukrainians on the ground.
I mean, I believe they've also talked to opposition members, but right now the only person due to like in polling that has any chance against him is Zelensky, and I mean he's if anything more anti-Russian than Zelensky is. I mean he's probably in some cases even more of like a war hawk than he is, and I mean that's not going to change anything for the like Russia won't accept him as the new president of Ukraine. I mean he's the only one that really has a chance, and you have all the other opposition members that are kind of opposed to Zelensky. They're not pro-Russian. They wouldn't agree to anything there. I mean, they're just as anti-Russian as he is. They just maybe have some disagreements on other things regarding politics, which happens. You'd have to find like a candidate that's polling at like 2 or 3% to find anyone that's slightly pro-Russian. I mean, realistically, you're not gonna get an election where they win unless you go full rigged election. I don't think that's really gonna go over well.
And even if that's the case, and if they even disqualify some of the people, I mean, I know Ukraine isn't a perfect democracy in the democracy index, but it's still a democracy, and the people on the ground, the people living there, are still incredibly anti-Russia. And that's not just saying people in Lviv. That's not saying people in Kyiv. We're talking about that are like directly affiliated, like people that were in Mariupol that refused to leave until it was too late. Even those people are still anti-Russian. So like it goes across the entire country. So being able to just be able to pluck a leader because he falls in line with a peace deal with Russia doesn't mean that person's not going to get voted out or worse, forced to resign or impeached before a quarter passes after that occurs. So I think it's a non-starter for the people of Ukraine. But at the end of the day, like where are the concessions that Putin's willing to make? Because if this war is going to end, not saying it's going to, I don't believe that at all. I'm very hawkish in this. What are concessions that Putin would make, if any, to allow this war to actually end?
Right now, I don't see any realistic concessions that they'd be willing to make because I don't think they have much they can give up that wouldn't go against the whole idea of their special military operation. It wouldn't be like a massive political blow at home. I mean, even if there was a ceasefire and they got some agreement and got to keep the territory they'd gained and the war ended tomorrow, I mean, they're still like have to keep a lot of troops in Ukraine to keep, the population under control because as you said, even the people in occupied territories aren't exactly happy they're there. I mean, when you have a whole, partisan operation start up or continue, but like be like the main focus, I mean, that's also going to be, hell for the Russian troops that get to stay behind in Ukraine that don't get sent home.
Someone in the Trump administration needs to listen to this podcast. Unironically. Because Biden, again, terrible foreign policy, incredibly weak. However, people in his administration realize that this is a very, very good position for the United States as well as for the West collectively as a whole to degrade Russia into nothingness. Like Putin took this step. He basically put the bullet, he loaded a 44 revolver and put it in his mouth and is squeezing the trigger right now. And all he needs is us to push it a little bit further. Yet for some reason, like there's like hesitation there. Like it's
Like
just
three,
no sense to me.
it's like
Well,
three different people fighting to get the gun out of his mouth.
and
Exactly.
that that was the most frustrating thing to me about Biden's policy in Ukraine was we were giving them just enough to continue the fight, but not enough to win it. And we saw them just creeping up that escalation ladder, and it was incredibly frustrating to watch. But as to what Russia can give up, what are they going to do? Say, oh, we promise we won't invade again? They breached the Budapest memorandum by going into Crimea the first time, and obviously just completely tore it to shreds with the full invasion. So they can't be trusted to keep their word on that front. So that's why I was pointing out before there needs to be external actors that are going to provide that security guarantee. And the whole point of the Budapest memorandum was anti proliferation and to get nuclear weapons, minimize the number of countries that had them. I don't think countries are going to give up weapons in the future because we saw Libya and Ukraine. It didn't really work out all that well for them. And one of my biggest fears coming out of this is that we will see countries that don't trust the United States to provide that protection, and we do see an increase in countries seeking these nuclear weapons. And I'm not just talking about Europe in that case. I think we'll see that potentially across the board.
Yeah, we're
I mean,
seeing
I think
red lines
that's
Russia previously had, or the USSR previously had, just be completely axed. And like the fact that we're not just being like, oh, well, then there is no red line, let's just push forward and completely eradicate the Russian opposition. Like there's no like I'm looking at my phone today, like reading, okay, I guess Poland wants nuclear weapons. All right. If you had told me that 5 years ago, I would have like hysterically laughed and like shrugged you off as just an imbecile. But like that's the life that we're living right now. And like that 5 years ago, according to Putin, would have been a red line where missiles would be flying. Yet it's something that's just happening on a Friday. Like
it
not
hadn't even been mentioned.
yeah, you know what I mean? Or like the fact that France and the UK are like, all right, maybe we should try to get a coalition of the willing. And I know it's UK and France, so it's never gonna happen. It's just talk. But at the end of the day, like that stuff would be like back in the day, as an analyst, I would hear that and be like, oh shit, we're gonna be in war tomorrow. But like over and over and over again, there's no weight, there's no meat on the bone. It's just hollow. I mean, hell, there's Ukrainians in Russia, in Kursk Oblast right now, killing Russians on Russia territory, and it hasn't escalated. They haven't used VX, they haven't used a tactical nuclear weapon. Hell, they haven't even done a nuclear demonstration. Like they haven't even breached just a nuclear test, which is like something that early on in the war we're like, okay, if this escalates and continues to escalate in the way we're thinking, they're going to at least do a nuclear test to like show that they're capable of doing it. But Russia has done nothing. And maybe that's a Putin strategy that none of us are privy to, but it just completely goes against the fabric of the post Cold War world in which we lived with the Russian Federation and how it interacts with the West.
Especially when you consider just like how little money the US has actually spent to basically drain Russia of its entire Soviet inheritance, like in vehicles. I mean, it took them the entire Cold War to build up that stockpile that is now almost depleted for pennies on the dollar, what like the US normally spends on defense. And people will say that that's, it's too much money to be spent into Ukraine. Yeah, you're sending money to Ukraine, but you're basically subsidizing the entire U.S. military at the same time
Most
at
most of that
pennies on the
money's
dollar.
most of that money's being spent in the United States. We're refreshing our stocks. I will say, Christian, one thing that Russia did do was they showed off the re-entry vehicle. I think that was in Odessa, unarmed.
Yeah, the MIRVs, yeah. But that's technology that we like
Yeah,
that to be using a conventional arm, no matter what like it was like the hypersonic missile, quote unquote, the Kinsnall or whatever the hell they call it, like back in 20, I think it was what, end of 2022, like November,
Well,
December. That
strapping his candor to a plane, fire it horizontally.
yeah,
It's
cool. Like you guys have
I mean,
MIRV.
this
Everybody does. Like, I was expecting them to like, all right, blow and like put a fucking NOTAM up over the Black Sea and explode a nuclear weapon over the Black Sea. Like that's like to me, that's like the oh fuck, like, okay, we're there. We're at the red line. Maybe we'll listen to you, Putin. But like we've been just crossing every single red line. Like it's just like they're dotted and they're like 5 miles apart. And we're just completely like just walking through willy-nilly with any issue. To the point of the to the point of the US armament of Ukraine. Massive fucking win for us. Absolutely, absolutely fantastic. We're getting rid of arms we wouldn't otherwise have used. And to the point of like and to the point of the position of stopping the armaments to Ukraine and make no it's a logical fallacy because A, we're being isolationists with our current administration and our foreign policy. If that's the case, we don't need guns. We don't need arms. We if you want to be the Switzerland of the world, if that's the true mantra, we want to be a major economic power with resources and hands in every bucket. If we want to do that, why do we need thousands of HIMARS? Why do we need thousands and tens of thousands of 155 millimeter artillery shells? Just hand them over at that point. You know, the logic makes no sense to me. And if we wanted to pursue that so well, and that's the image that we're trying to persuade to the world, there's something to be said about disarming to some extent, giving those to the people that need them. And then, yeah, if you want to have some sort of pact where dollar for dollar, Ukraine helps the economic buildup or like prioritizes using US contractors to help restore the country when the war's over. Absolutely. No one's objecting to that. No one in Ukraine's objecting to that. No one in the United States is objecting to that. If that's if that's the end all mission, you want it to be more of a transaction, go ahead. But at the end of the day, if we're just stockpiling this shit, just stockpile it so some reservist in Tennessee can dust it off every Tuesday, like it makes no fucking sense. It makes no fucking sense.
well, if we keep trending in this direction, I think one of the things I want to borrow from Switzerland is the fact that every single citizen has a spot in a in a bunker. We definitely don't have that infrastructure here. But I think one of the problems that we run into, the Trump presidency, and they've been so focused on so much of this foreign policy and shaking everything up. It's not something that is going to catch the attention of most American voters because I don't think most American voters have a very strong understanding of foreign policy or really take it that much into account when they're in the voting booth. For example, the majority of Americans thought that we were spending something like 25% of the budget on foreign aid when it makes up less than 1%. So getting that message and having people have a better understanding of why things have been done the way they are, we might, if we had a more educated populace on that front, maybe they would feel a little bit more responsibility in terms of how they are going about making these changes in foreign policy.
A weaker Russia and a weaker China makes a stronger United States, and I think that needs to be the refresher to people's minds.
also, but just going back to what you said about stockpiling, I think you could pick up a phone tomorrow, and I think you could make a deal if you wanted to go isolationist, as you said, that if the U.S. were to send all of these stockpiles of things, I think Europe and definitely several countries in the EU, or maybe the EU as a whole, would be willing to pay for them. And the U.S. could get rid of this massive stockpile if you want to go isolationist, and the EU would probably pay them a fair price for everything. Just send it to Ukraine. I
Yeah,
don't think that's the problem. I think you can make that deal tomorrow, and I think most European countries would be willing to go along with that, like straight off, right off the bat.
I know we've been going for a bit here, but to that point, it's very important to bring that up because the United States did cut off some intelligence sharing as well as deactivating some of the mapping features and GeoInt for targeting for some of these systems. India today is kind of like really hesitant with buying more munitions from the United States with the thought process that if one day the United States decides they can just shut it off. So to the point of that's why I made my comment earlier about Europe needing to rearm themselves and making the factories for themselves. Because if we were going to continue treading down this path of having absolute control over every munition that we sell, it puts it in a really bad spot for those countries when they actually have to use those munitions if the United States decides that on a whim it's going to change foreign policy, whether that be with a new president, a new or even a new SecDef that gets sworn in, like that should not be in the beholdence of the person selling the arms. It should be in the responsibility of the person using it. If that's the logic we're using for guns in America, it should be the logic we should use for the countries we sell said guns to. It shouldn't just fall on the US population to like have the control of an arm to be the civilian that purchases a Glock, just to the same extent that that should follow. If an F-35 is bought by Poland, Poland should be able to use that F-35 how they want without the United States getting involved and shutting off certain flight systems and targeting systems. And I think to India's point, like that's a major red flag if you're going to continue to purchase these weapons and potentially have them inoperable because the United States decides one day that they want them to be inoperable.
I actually have a theory that I think some of the reason that the intelligence was turned off and is appears to be slightly turned on again, but no one really knows for sure. I could imagine that Trump, or at least someone in his cabinet or admin, got a phone call from a very, very angry U.S. military industrial complex that had gotten together, talked about it, and said, "We've seen Rheinmetall stock over the last month. We've seen our own stock. If you keep doing this, you are going to end up bankrupting us, and we would not like this to happen." I
Yeah.
think that is going to be like a major key to maybe bringing some normalcy back into this, because I think at some point companies like Lockheed Martin, all these are going to have to start like back channel wise through lobbyists and stuff. They're going to start speaking up because it is costing them a lot of money with these like random decisions on a whim that are going to end up costing them contracts worth billions and billions of dollars in the future.
It's also going
There are a
to
lot.
it's also going to cost the normal U.S. American who has their entire retirement tied up in mostly technology and defense companies in its current state. And to your point before, like the European defense industry right now is I wish I got in a couple months ago. Like their stocks are outperforming 4 to 10 times what the United States defense complex is in the current moment. Like they're doing so well, with the idea that hey, maybe the U.S. is an unreliable player and the world is a dangerous place, and this is a wake up call for Europe, as you would say, Oliver.
Well, and Germany already had a very large military industrial complex. Most of the sales go abroad, but as Germany starts this rearmament, and I think they realized in Mali when they were supposed to be supporting MINUSMA that they had a problem. That was probably the canary in the coal mine. But once they fix some of their procurement problems and they start investing this money from the EU, yeah, I think that's going to continue. So it wouldn't surprise me if there is some pushback from the military contractors in the United States and organizations like Lockheed. So I think
I
yeah,
think for Germany, it's also the perfect time because I mean they've seen a downward spiral for their auto manufacturing, which has been a backbone of their country for, I wouldn't say forever, but at least since for the past many, many, many years. And now suddenly you're going to start having a lot of defense manufacturers ramping up production that can give some jobs to people that lost jobs in the downward automotive spiral. I think that's going to be good for their economy, and it's going to help revitalize their economy.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I think the doomer position is I don't I, that a lot of people have the thought process that Europe can't adapt quickly enough, but I'm on the contrary to that to some extent, because I think the war in Ukraine has proven that less sophisticated weaponry is better. Um, Drones super easy to manufacture, and with the current tool set that most EU countries have, they could spin up a massive drone facility and make that useful. Same with artillery shells. That's another super easy six-step process to make a 155 shell, and they could do that. Same with building some howitzers and other platforms such as that. But yeah, I mean, we could probably talk about this for the rest of history. That
Yeah, like those cheaper weapon systems, they'll never get you 100% of the way there. Like $1 million missile will always be better, but if you can get 75% of the way there for a tenth of the price, it's going to be very, very lucrative for a lot of these smaller countries that can suddenly amass a defense against a much larger opponent with a much smaller budget because they can just, just buy more weapons. More weapons are usually always better in these situations. And I mean, there's also going to be a kind of slight irony in the fact that with Elon Musk and his stance on this, that it's going to end up having probably workers that were building Teslas in this gigafactory in Berlin are probably going to end up building tanks for Ukraine in the next year, given that sales of Teslas in Germany dropped 76% in February year on year, while at the same time electric car sales went up over 30%. So
I mean, even the United States decided $500,000 for a shell on the Zumwalt was too much. So, yeah, no, I think that is where it's trending. And as you said, Christian, we could talk about this ad nauseum. There's still plenty of stuff to discuss. Want to thank Oliver for joining us today. This has been the bottom line up front.